Now, US President Donald Trump has extended the ceasefire with Iran indefinitely after plans for peace talks in Pakistan stalled. But Iranian officials have dismissed this as a ploy to buy time before a surprise strike. Meanwhile, tensions in the Strait of Hormuz remain high as the US and Iran continue their blockades in and around the Strait of Hormuz, and both sides have seized vessels.
Ships stuck near the Strait of Hormuz as Iran and the US continue to block both ends of the crucial shipping lane in a standoff. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard says it seized at least 2 ships trying to sail through the passage. This video from the ship tracking service Marine Traffic shows the locations of the 2 vessels as they tried to navigate the strait. Earlier this week, Iran put on a show of military might at home. The army paraded missiles in front of crowds of pro-government supporters on the streets of Tehran as the regime refused to commit to a second round of peace talks with the US in Pakistan. US President Donald Trump has extended the ceasefire at Pakistan's request. Trump posted on social media, "I have therefore directed our military to continue the blockade and, in all other respects, remain ready and able, and will therefore extend the ceasefire until such a time as their proposal is submitted and discussions are concluded." But there are few signs that Iranian negotiators are ready to meet the US team again in Pakistan. An Iranian government official dismissed the ceasefire extension as a US ploy to organize a surprise attack on the country.
Well, Kashani-Sabet is Professor of History at the University of Pennsylvania and joins us now from New York. Welcome to DW. What's your thinking about why Donald Trump extended this ceasefire after previously threatening to destroy Iran's civilization and civilian infrastructure unless a deal was done?
Thank you so much for inviting me to your show. I think that President Trump has explored a series of venues and tactics in order to find a way to either mitigate the conflict, bring it to some kind of a resolution, and none of them seems to have worked effectively. This has run the gamut, as you pointed out, from the shocking and appalling threat on the entirety of Iranian civilization, to now, an extension of the ceasefire. And I think that this about face really has to do with the kind of pressure that the American president, faces at home regarding the lack of popularity of this war, the increasing amount of economic pressure that has been borne not only by people in the United States but across the world as a result of the standoff in the Persian Gulf, and yet there are no easy solutions, are there? And so I think that this is a very sad and rude awakening that has hit the administration.
Except that there's been no change in the public posture of either side in this war. So under what circumstances would you expect a second round of peace talks to happen? Or maybe that's a better question. Do you expect there to be another round of peace talks?
I think that there is a bit of a shift, but it's not a public or highly publicized shift. So, for example, the head of Iran's delegation, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, he delivered a speech that was rather more subdued domestically. This is very different from, the kind of speech or the kind of language that is used internationally. There was a recognition that, certainly Iran has put up probably a surprisingly decent fight in this conflict. And yet there was the recognition that, of course, militarily, Iran is simply weaker. I mean, that's just the reality. Similarly, I would say in the United States, this war was not the easy kind of takeover that the Trump administration or some in the Trump administration had hoped that it would be, or initially had touted it as one that would be. And so I think that there have been shifts in the position of both countries. And I do anticipate that privately, if not publicly, there are enough elements within the administrations of both countries that recognize that ultimately diplomacy will have to prevail in this conflict. There's some who disagree with that, but I personally do believe that at the end of the day, it will have to be resolved through diplomacy.
And this ceasefire extension, we heard at the top of this item, it's being poo-pooed, if I can use that expression. It's being poo-pooed in Iran. How is that this indefinite ceasefire that Donald Trump announced, how is that being portrayed inside the country?
I mean, I think that there's some understandable skepticism about the ceasefire. Is this really a ceasefire? Is this an attempt to rearm? Is this, some kind of a diplomatic ploy? Is the ceasefire really to Iran's advantage? I mean, I think those are legitimate questions that are being explored by the Islamic Republic government. But on the other hand, I do think that there's a reason why we got to this point. There's a reason why this 2-week period has been extended. I don't think that either party is rushing to restart hostilities despite the standoff in the Strait of Hormuz right now. But again, unfortunately, conflicts like this are highly unpredictable. And sometimes all it takes is one unexpected sort of trigger. And that's what I hope, and many people hope, that diplomacy will obviate.
Great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor. Professor Firouzeh Kashani-Sabet from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thank you so much for your time.
Burcu Ozcelik is a senior research fellow for Middle East security at the Royal United Services Institute. With the ceasefire extended indefinitely and the peace talks on hold, I asked her if Donald Trump just essentially froze this conflict.
It certainly appears that way. One point, I suppose, is that subsequently, the White House seems to have walked back the extension of the ceasefire, stating that it's not indefinite. There have been reports that President Trump expects the Iranian negotiating team to come up with a more coherent, consensus-driven position in 3 to 5 days. That's the latest that we're hearing. So a little bit of resistance to the idea that this is an indefinite extension. But there was a fair amount of confusion late last night when the announcement arrived that the U.S. was unilaterally agreeing to extend the ceasefire. And it's not clear what the basis of the terms are for what is expected to happen during this now 3 to 5 days, or potentially longer again, where we don't know. What Iran is expected to deliver ahead of the talks is not clear at the moment.
Now, indefinitely or not, Trump has repeatedly postponed his deadlines. How does that affect the power dynamics in this conflict?
Well, I think it has created a high level of confusion. There has been signaling from both sides, not just President Trump, but the Iranians have also demonstrated perhaps some division internally and disagreement about what position to hold both ahead of the talks and during the talks. And so there seems to be some echoing going on in terms of the type of a coercive bargaining that both sides are playing. But again, we don't yet know what President Trump is hoping to achieve in advance of the talks, any preconditions that he may have put on the table to enable the US negotiating team to travel to Islamabad. What we have heard is that the position from Tehran's leadership is almost a precondition that the U.S. lift its blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz. We haven't seen that happen. So alongside President Trump's declaration that the ceasefire has been extended, the U.S. naval blockade continues.
I want to look at the Strait of Hormuz in a second, but first, zooming in on something that Donald Trump said in his statement there. He says that the Iranian leadership is seriously fractured. Who is in charge in Tehran right now?
That's the big question. And I think it's tempting to state that there is clear signs of division or fragmentation. I'm not sure that that's true. What Iran seems to be insisting on right now is a way to preserve what it defines as its national interest, its red lines, its own sovereign priorities as Iran defines it to be so. That doesn't mean that there isn't disagreement in Tehran. I think there certainly is, and the impact of the 6-week war and the leadership decapitation strikes, the various damage that Iran has experienced over the course of the war will have had a significant impact on its ability to coherently deliver its message and to arrive at consensus-driven decision-making. Who is in charge? We have the supreme leader who is not yet to have been heard or seen from. The IRGC, already an ascendant power before the war, seems to be calling the shots to a different extent now, which isn't surprising given that Iran understands itself still to be at war. And then we have the civilian, the diplomatic, the negotiating team led by parliamentary speaker and Foreign Minister Arakci, who seem to be taking a more accommodationist view to return to talks with Washington. And there seems to be where the divergence really lies, what conditions Iran must insist upon before returning to Islamabad, and whether the pressure point is just deemed to be too high to agree to returning to Islamabad without certain demands being met by the Trump administration.
Yeah. Tensions remain high in the Strait of Hormuz. You mentioned it earlier. The U.S. blockade stands. Iran has reportedly attacked 3 ships there. Is this the theater in which this war will ultimately be decided?
That's certainly fair to say. And we have seen over the past few weeks Iran very effectively displacing the center of gravity of the conflict from its own territory, from strikes against Iranian critical infrastructure and military sites over to the site of economic warfare, where Iran is identified and very effectively leveraged its geography. It's effectively weaponized its geography by blocking the Strait of Hormuz to all non-friendly vessels. The Americans responded with a blockade of Iranian ports, which objectively appears to be working. We've seen greater escalation, more volatility in the earlier hours of today. But the Strait of Hormuz has become central, undoubtedly, to how this conflict will eventually be concluded, or whether it ends in some type of uncomfortable no peace, no war stalemate. But the Strait of Hormuz has certainly emerged as a key leverage that Iran wants to retain. But the question is, can it do so in peacetime? And I think the negotiations very clearly are focused on unlocking the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. Israel is, of course, a party to this conflict and not a party to these negotiations. How do they fit into the equation? Because the status quo was certainly not the outcome they were hoping for.
That's right. And we saw an unprecedented level of coordination in the joint strikes from February 28th onwards between the United States and Israel. Israel seems to have been sidelined from Trump's subsequent decisions to enter into talks with Iran. We saw some statements from Israeli government officials expressing skepticism about the effectiveness of this policy, or the pivot that Trump has been trying to practice. Interestingly, we're seeing 3 different ceasefires being attempted across the Middle East. We have a ceasefire in Lebanon, a ceasefire in Gaza, both very complicated, complex processes, and now this very fragile and volatile ceasefire between the US and Iran. Israel has its own set of priorities and national security interests, undoubtedly, and I suspect that there is an ongoing sense of skepticism around the effectiveness of these talks. And the question is, and has been for some time, the extent of the coordination and ongoing cohesion between the United States and Israel. But for now, it seems that President Trump is not interested in pursuing the immediate escalation pathway to resuming military strikes. The ceasefire extension seems to indicate that. But at the same time, given the volatility of the moment, and that both sides, Iran and the United States, are so very far apart in the negotiations and their positions there, it, I think, is too soon to say that the military option is completely off the table. I think that remains as a possibility.
Fascinating insights. That was Burcu Ozcelik of the Royal United Services Institute. Thank you so much.